So we've begun thinking about how we grow and how we multiply. And those two things are linked quite strongly. Because what I want to suggest in this video is that to grow larger, you need to go smaller. Let me pick up a bit on what I mean by that, and let me do that by going back to some of our experience. So, two big things that happened during our time in Bearwood. Here's the first one. We arrived at the church to find that there were, I think, two life groups. And one of them was only sort of half functioning, two home groups as we call them there. So one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing was multiplying those small groups. I think that we moved from having, in fact, really just the one group, to having about 8 or 9 small groups meeting through the week, and they would meet at different times of the day. Some would meet during the daytime, some would meet in the evening, but lots and lots of little different groups. And beyond that, we probably were seeing people doing stuff informally that we didn't know about and would happen from time to time. Here's the second thing that happened. I've talked a bit about that when we were looking at that backstory, my experience. Was this, that we came to a church that had about 70, 80 people, and it grew to around about 200, but we never had all 200 people in the same room at the same time, because what we did was we moved from having a single gathering at past 10 to 12 o'clock on a Sunday morning to 2 Sunday morning gatherings, one at 9:30, one at 11:15. Some things that would have been common between the two. There was worship, there was teaching. We didn't do here's the traditional service, here's the modern service kind of thing. There was a mixture of both, and we encouraged both of them to be congregations for all ages, but we did things slightly different. So the 9:30 service, we tended to run it. Leaning into all age, we would take the children out for 20 minutes whilst the sermon was happening, so they could do some arts and craft. But actually, their initial bit of teaching happened in the main gathering. The 11:15 congregation, we ran a formal children's program. That meant that we had a bit more space. So the 9:30 congregation, it was tight. We had to keep it to an hour, just because of having to be ready for the next congregation to come in. And the 11:15 having a bit more space to go a bit longer, deeper in the teaching. We had space to do communion every Sunday, that kind of thing. But as I mentioned in that other video, we also had a congregation that grew out of a youth group on a Sunday night, and we went cafe style. We sat around tables, and so again some common themes. All ages there, from families that would bring their kids with them. We didn't have a kids work, but they could play with some toys, and there was stuff for them to do if they turn up at that sort of late stage in the day, through to these old ladies in their 90s but we sang, we used YouTube for that, made it be a bit louder, and could do stuff that maybe our musicians weren't confident with, introduce more songs, more variety. And we sat round tables and we studied the Bible. Model for that was that we would usually have a starter question, something fun, something engaging. It was like the fact people in to questions you might be asking. Then again, we can do some observational questions. By the way, my general approach to Bible study is actually there's really only two questions we can ask people, and that is what is going on in the Bible passage, what's going on here, and what has that got to do with us? But that sometimes needs a bit more breaking down. But we would do some Bible questions, just observation, what does the Bible passage say? And then we dig a bit deeper with questions that focused on what did it mean, and might pick up on some of the more challenging, harder to understand, the more controversial aspects as well. And then questions that we called a look at ourselves, where we got people to think about what the application of the what does it have to do with me? Does it have to do with us questions? And we would spend 45 minutes to an hour digging into God's Word. So we were able to extend that kind of teaching time and get serious. And as I've mentioned previously, again, that wasn't bringing intellectuals, it wasn't like students and graduates and middle class people, that was people from all kinds of backgrounds engaging with God's Word. I will probably sometime, it's a different subject, talk a bit more about how we go longer and go deeper with people that are used to things being short and shallow, but that's for another time. And then we had stuff happening in the middle of the week, but we also, as I mentioned before, we then had the Saturday night congregation where Spanish was usually the main language of translation, and we began to try some things on a Sunday afternoon. But what we were consistently doing was multiplying. And that's partly because we needed to find ways to increase capacity where space was limited. But also, I would say that there is this sense that you grow bigger by going smaller. And whether that's that you end up with lots of life groups, community groups, home groups, whatever you call it, in a large congregation that all gather together. You know, you get a church of 200 or 300 and they all meet at the same time together, but you have lots and lots of small groups. Or as we had, you had multiple congregations that added up to about 200, and obviously there are churches that have, again, you know, they go 400, 500, 1,000, whatever, that kind of model. Or what you're seeing is churches planted out, maybe multi-site, but also planting new independent churches. There's a sense that you have grown larger, maybe not your own church, and in a sense it doesn't matter, we're not about growing our own empires, are we? But there's a sense, particularly if hopefully this is growth that includes people becoming Christians, coming in from outside, or just transfer growth, but what you're wanting to see is the growth of God's kingdom. So God's kingdom is a bit larger, even if they're not part of the same organisational church. And we might add in that we were involved in the church in a revitalisation project as well, to further sort of extension. But the point is that there's been growth in size, but there's also been this smallness that has come with the multiplication. And that links in to what we talked about last time, about how, as Moses was seeking to lead a growing people of God, he was advised and encouraged by Jethro, his father-in-law, to start to split people into smaller groups. There's great wisdom in that. And the wisdom is this, that there's a limit to how many people anyone can connect with. And that's the first thing. So in terms of building deep relationships with others, both for leaders and for members of the group, actually there's a limit. And so you want that smallness, you want space for people to really get to know each other in a meaningful way. And what you tend to find is that when you have a single group of about 40-50 people, that there are limits there. Actually, one of the limits is to how well you can get to know and invest in each other's lives. And that's the challenge, because people will feel like they know each other, but actually there isn't the depth to that. They know people by name, they visibly see them in church, and they may have a brief chat with one another about the football or how work is going or that kind of thing with different people each week, or a cup of coffee. But actually there's not the depth to that really allows for one another, ministry, pastoral care for one another, challenging and encouraging and discipling one another, speaking into each other's lives. So you can feel like you know everyone, but in fact you don't. And the church can superficially feel like it is loving and caring and welcoming, but may not be as good at those things as it thinks it is. And then one of the challenges then is that church grows a bit, is also that you have, in effect, naturally, people start to break into groups. Did you realise that? When we break into small groups within the church, we're just following what is happening naturally, but making sure it is intentional. Just as you get plants from churches that happen naturally. It's just that if you allow that to happen, it's usually a split. So it's good to get ahead of the curve, because the groupings you might get might not be the ones that you want. What you tend to have is one group, which is the people that have always been there, and they become the inner circle, and that becomes cliquey, and it's hard for people to join into the church. They will always feel like they're outsiders. And then you've got the outer circle as the other group. And that inner circle is connected together. People do know each other because they've always known each other. But it's limited, it's restricted, and it's closed. Whereas you start to create groups that are open and can include more people, new people in them much more easily. What that means actually is that people start to get from those smaller groups um, the things that those groups are designed to give in terms of fellowship and intimacy and one another stuff. It helps with communication because you can talk things through and make sure people are getting the right messages and that there's feedback on that. And the other thing about going small in that kind of way is this. You get to multiply gifting and you grow the gifting and so the spiritual health of the church. Because you might remember when I said that Bearwood, we realised that the best thing to do was to multiply the congregations in the same building. I said that one of the things I realised was that would grow my opportunities, that I could be preaching the good news about Jesus to more people just as many times as we needed to through the day. But in fact, that wasn't something I was going to do. I wasn't going to be preaching 4 or 5 times each weekend, every weekend. There were occasions where I found myself doing that. But actually what I tried to make sure that I did was that I might speak a couple of times on a weekend, and some weekends I wouldn't speak at all. Because our model was to have lots and lots of people involved so that there was a plurality to teaching and preaching. As you grow gifts, whether it's multiple congregations or church plants, you've got people that then have an opportunity to preach and teach that wouldn't have. And when you've got these life groups, you can actually start to multiply the people who are teaching in their small groups. That also means that there are people that are able to use teaching gifts, that they're not put off because their gift is to teach, but it's not to stand in front of a large crowd, that they're able to work with a small group. And sometimes the people that can preach and teach in front of a large crowd are not the people who can work with a small group. Those are actually different gifts. But also one of the things we found, you're in a charismatic context, so that might be different in terms of your kind of theological outlook, your style. But we have found that our small groups, we found it back then, we find it in our current church, are places where people can start to use gifts like prophecy. It's a place where people can pray for one another for healing and that kind of thing. So there's a multiplication of gifts. It's a place where people can offer hospitality, and more people can do that. And what that means is that there's the growth because it gives more routes in, more ways to join, but also because I would argue that it is lifting the church in terms of the gifting in the church, the resources that are within the church, but it is also creating more warmth, more love, more care, more welcome in the church. It increases the health of the church and enables it to grow further and makes this a church that people want to join, want to be part of. So those are all good reasons for multiplying. And then there is just the basics of it. And I'm thinking at the planting and the multiplying congregations level. So one reason for planting a new church to grow is that it means you can reach a community, a context, a geographical area, a neighbourhood, a culture where there might be barriers, visible and invisible, to people coming into an existing church. One of the things we found at Bearwood is that having multiple congregations on a Sunday and also connecting with people in small groups in the week as well, was that there were people that actually the time of day was a barrier. And so we crossed those barriers. We went to not where they were, but when they were, and they were available. We gave them that permission to come and gather when they were able to. And alongside that as well, it allowed for variety without undermining the unity of the church, without becoming a kind of consumerist, pick your option, pick your style. We were alert that there were some people that would engage better through that sort of discussional stuff on a Sunday night, and through that sort of louder worship music, if you like, just as there were people who preferred something a bit more reflective, just as there were those who would struggle to concentrate for too long, and just as there were those who benefited most when we gave them some deep teaching and we said, you don't have to worry about your kids, we're going to take them and do something with them, and also the children were hearing the good news as well. And of course, then there were people who simply, the barrier was the language, and we needed to work with that as well. So grow larger by growing smaller, and start to multiply as a church into new congregations and new churches by first of all multiplying internally. So if you want to plant churches, if you want to multiply that way, if you want to go from being one church to two churches to four churches, well, go from being a single group that only meets together once to being a church that is a single gathering that has 2 life groups, 4 life groups, 6 life groups, 8 life groups. Go from being a church of one congregation to multiple congregations, and give those congregations, give those life groups, give those congregations that permission to grow, to develop, to the point where they might one day be churches themselves. So I'd love to hear a bit more about your own experience. I'd also love to hear if there's particular questions or things that you'd like us to pick up in these videos. So please use the comments below to share them. Thank you.